August 2nd, 1944, 10:47 hours. Hauptmann Erich Sommer pushed forward the throttles of his Arado Ar 234 Blitz, and the twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines answered with a sound completely different from anything encountered during his 87 prior reconnaissance sorties. The machine gathered speed along the Juvincourt airfield runway in northern France, balanced atop a detachable wheeled trolley that would separate after becoming airborne. Mounted in the lower fuselage, the RB-50/30th's automated camera held 3 film cassettes. His objective? Capture images of the Normandy landing zones where Allied troops were assembling the enormous Mulberry temporary ports. He possessed 90 minutes of aviation fuel, carried no weapons for defense, only velocity. RF Spitfire Mark XIVs stood ready for engagement with radar installations monitoring all activity. Yet Sommer was moments away from learning something that would revolutionize aerial intelligence collection permanently. At 740 kilometers per hour, he possessed complete visual access while remaining beyond enemy reach. By August 1944, circumstances above northern France had grown critical for Luftwaffe intelligence-gathering missions. 60 days following D-Day, Allied command of the skies was total. Each German reconnaissance plane venturing toward the landing areas encountered overwhelming opposition from pursuit aircraft, ground-based weapons, and integrated defense networks that rendered survival virtually impossible. The conventional Luftwaffe reconnaissance platforms, the Junkers Ru-88 and adapted Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighters, were suffering catastrophic losses. During July 1944 alone, German intelligence aviation lost 47 machines over France. Aviators who returned characterized operations as certain death. The challenge wasn't determination or expertise, it was fundamental mechanics. Reciprocating engine reconnaissance planes operated at 480 to 550 kilometers per hour. Allied pursuit craft, especially the Supermarine Spitfire Mark 14 equipped with its Griffin power plant, achieved 721 kilometers per hour at operational height. The engagement success percentage exceeded 80%. The intelligence ramifications were grave. German leadership required comprehensive imagery of Allied expansion. Harbor installations, force deployments, and the Mulberry ports under construction at Arromanches and St. Lawrence-sur-Mer. These colossal artificial docks were permitting the Allies to deliver thousands of tons of material each day without seizing a natural deep-water facility. Assessing their capability and susceptibility was essential for German defensive strategy. Yet each photographic intelligence sortie concluded identically. Partial documentation, compromised machines, or deceased airmen, the Arado Ar 234 embodied a revolutionary approach. Design work had commenced in 1941, yet technological difficulties with primitive turbojet power plants postponed combat introduction until summer 1944. The airframe employed 2 Junkers Jumo 004B turbojets, each generating 900 kilograms of thrust. Peak velocity at altitude surpassed 740 kilometers per hour. Operational ceiling achieved 11,000 meters. Critically, it housed the RB-50/30th's automated reconnaissance camera within the fuselage, capable of capturing sequential images across extensive territory without aviator involvement. However, the AR-234 possessed constraints that mirrored Germany's declining manufacturing circumstances. The Jumo 004 power plants were unreliable, with operational longevity of merely 10 to 25 hours before demanding maintenance or substitution. The machine burned fuel at a pace that restricted sorties to roughly 90 minutes. Preparing aviators to operate jets demanded specialized training that few Luftwaffe institutions could deliver, and manufacturing was agonizingly sluggish. By August 1944, only a small number of AR-234s existed, most allocated to Versuchsverband Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, the experimental command formation assessing operational feasibility. The calculations of the circumstances were harsh. The Allies were constructing Liberty ships more rapidly than submarines could destroy them, manufacturing fighters more quickly than the Luftwaffe could eliminate them, and delivering supplies into Normandy faster than German troops could organize successful counterstrikes. The AR-234 could observe everything, yet observation was insufficient. Germany required 2,000 of them in 1943. In August 1944, they possessed perhaps 12 operational machines. Hauptmann Erich Sommer was 28 years of age and had been conducting reconnaissance sorties since 1941. He had survived the Battle of Britain piloting modified Bf-109s, documented Soviet emplacements during Operation Barbarossa, and spent 2 years evading Allied fighters above France and the Low Countries. His service record documented 87 reconnaissance sorties and 4 aircraft destroyed by hostile action. He had parachuted twice, executed 1 crash landing, and returned with combat damage countless times. In July 1944, Sommer had been reassigned to Versuchsverband OBDL at Juvincourt. The formation's purpose was to assess new aircraft and procedures under combat circumstances. Upon first observing the AR-234, his response was doubt combined with interest. The jet power plants were unlike anything he'd operated. The departure sequence, balanced on a jettison trolley that detached after liftoff, appeared dangerously intricate, and touching down on a retractable skid rather than standard landing wheels seemed like a formula for catastrophe. Yet the evaluation flights altered his viewpoint. The acceleration was remarkable. The ascent rate surpassed anything reciprocating engines could accomplish, and the velocity at altitude made him sense, for the first occasion in 3 years, that he could finish a sortie and live. The Jumo 004 power plants shrieked rather than rumbled, a piercing whine that was disturbing initially, but became comforting once he comprehended their capability. The operation briefing on August 1st had been direct. Document the mulberry harbors at Aromanches. The installations were plainly observable from Allied-held airspace, yet intelligence required comprehensive overhead imagery revealing their capability, arrangement, and susceptibility. Earlier efforts by Ru-88s had been unsuccessful. 1 machine destroyed, another so compromised it barely returned. Filmed destroyed by defensive maneuvering. The AR-234 would attempt the operation at elevated altitude and peak velocity. Anticipated resistance. Spitfire Mark XIVs from RAF installations along the English shoreline, potentially launched from advanced airstrips in Normandy proper. Sommer's instructions were explicit. Sustain 7,000 to 9,000 meters altitude. Activate the automated camera above the objective zone. Execute 3 photographic passes if fuel allowed and return to Juvincourt. No engagement. No departure from navigation plan. The sortie was intelligence gathering exclusively. Yet everyone grasped the actual evaluation. Could a jet machine function with immunity in airspace controlled by Allied fighters? At 10:47 hours on August 2nd, Sommer released the wheel brakes. The AR-234 moved forward on its wheeled trolley, the jet power plants generating thrust swiftly. The departure roll was extensive, exceeding 1,000 meters as the machine accelerated to 185 kilometers per hour. At that velocity, he eased back carefully on the flight column. The aircraft rose smoothly, and at 200 meters altitude, he activated the trolley separation. The wheeled platform fell away, dropping toward the airfield beneath. The AR-234 was now operating on its retractable nose skid and wing-mounted skids exclusively. Touchdown would demand accuracy. He initiated an ascent at 650 kilometers per hour indicated, heading northwest toward the Normandy shoreline. Fuel quantity was 3,200 liters, adequate for roughly 90 minutes at combat power configurations. The Jumo 004 power plants operated smoothly, temperatures and pressures within acceptable parameters. The flight compartment was remarkably silent compared to reciprocating aircraft. The jet power plant sound was exterior, a continuous roar rather than the pulsating thunder of radial power plants. At 8,000 meters altitude, he stabilized and verified his location. The Normandy shoreline was observable ahead, a dark boundary against the paler ocean. The mulberry harbors at Aromanches would be unmistakable massive concrete structures forming an artificial breakwater with floating docks extending toward land. Allied vessels would be concentrated there. It was the most intensively protected airspace in France. His communications device crackled with German ground station transmissions. Allied detection installations along the English shoreline had identified his machine. British communications traffic, intercepted by German listening stations, verified Spitfires were launching from advanced airstrips. Calculated engagement time, 12 minutes. Summer verified his fuel. He possessed 2,800 liters remaining, adequate for 75 minutes of operation. The objective was 8 minutes distant. The calculations were direct. At 740 kilometers per hour ground velocity, he traversed 12.3 kilometers per minute. The Spitfire Mark 14, ascending from ocean level, could achieve perhaps 650 kilometers per hour by reaching his altitude, traversing 10.8 kilometers per minute. If the British pursuit craft were already airborne and ascending, they could achieve engagement location, yet closure velocity and positioning mattered more than absolute velocity. If he sustained his course and velocity and they approached from rear or beneath, the temporal opportunity for them to gain firing position would be calculated in seconds. He crossed the French shoreline at 10:59 hours, 12 minutes into the sortie. Fuel, 2,700 liters. The Aromanches region extended beneath him. The massive Mulberry Harbor plainly observable even from 8,000 meters. He could observe the concrete structures, the floating docks, numerous vessels offloading materiel. It was an intelligence analyst's ideal and a combat aviator's terror, intensively protected, critically significant, and until this instant impossible to document comprehensively. Summer engaged the RB-5030's camera apparatus. The automated camera, positioned in the fuselage lower section, initiated its program cycle. Every several seconds, it exposed a film frame, the sequential images configured to generate a complete assembly of the objective zone. He didn't require aiming or modification. The apparatus managed everything. His responsibility was sustaining constant altitude, course, and velocity. The initial photographic pass consumed 3 minutes, documenting the complete Aromanches harbor installation from west to east. The camera processed 40 exposures on the initial cassette. Beneath him, he could observe the magnitude of Allied logistics, hundreds of vehicles traveling along the provisional routes, supply concentrations observable as geometric configurations, the persistent movement of landing vessels between ships and shore. At 11:02, he finished the initial pass and turned carefully to re-establish for a second approach from an alternative angle. Fuel, 2,500 liters. Time available, roughly 65 minutes. No indication of engagement aircraft yet, though his communications monitoring suggested Spitfires were ascending toward his location. At 11:06, Summer identified them. 4 Spitfire Mark XIVs ascending aggressively from the southeast, contrails indicating their locations against the darker atmosphere beneath. They were at roughly 6,000 meters, 2,000 meters beneath him, and perhaps 8 kilometers behind, advancing rapidly, yet insufficiently rapidly. He sustained his course and velocity. The Spitfires were ascending at peak sustained power, trading velocity for altitude acquisition. Their ascent velocity at that altitude was perhaps 600 meters per minute. His jet power plants permitted him to accelerate while ascending if required, yet he didn't require it. The positioning was advantageous. The forward Spitfire achieved 7,000 meters at 11:09, now 5 kilometers behind. Summer calculated swiftly. The Spitfire's peak velocity at this altitude was roughly 721 kilometers per hour. He was operating at 740 kilometers per hour. Net closure velocity, 19 kilometers per hour, or approximately 0.3 kilometers per minute. To eliminate 5 kilometers would require nearly 17 minutes. He would finish his operation and be midway back to France in that duration. Yet the RAF aviators were skilled. They comprehended the positioning challenge. Rather than pursuing directly from behind, where closure velocity was minimal, they attempted an engagement trajectory. 2 Spitfires separated right, ascending to obstruct him on his return path. 2 maintained the rear pursuit, hoping to compel him into defensive actions that would diminish his velocity advantage. Summer observed the tactical circumstances develop with professional fascination. This was the genuine evaluation. Could they compel him to deviate from his operation? He chose to determine. At 11:12, he initiated his second photographic pass, intentionally sustaining direct and horizontal flight above the most intensively protected segment of the landing zone. The two Spitfires attempting the engagement trajectory were now at 7,500 meters, converging from his right. Distance, 6 kilometers. Their positioning was superior, yet they still confronted the fundamental challenge to accomplish a firing location. They required matching his altitude, velocity, and course sufficiently long to target and discharge. That demanded sustained capability their reciprocating power plants couldn't sustain. At 11:15, the nearest Spitfire discharged weapons from roughly 800 meters behind and 500 meters beneath. Summer observed the tracer's arc through space, falling insufficient and behind. The British aviator was discharging at extreme distance, hoping for a fortunate strike. None materialized. The Spitfire's Hispano cannons possessed a peak functional distance of 600 meters against a non-maneuvering objective. Against an objective 200 kilometers per hour faster, and at different altitude the ballistic calculation was nearly impossible. He finished the second photographic pass at 11:18. Fuel, 2,200 liters. The RB-50/30th camera had processed 80 exposures across 2 cassettes, 1 cassette available. He possessed adequate fuel for 1 additional pass in the homeward flight. The tactical circumstances had transformed. The 2 Spitfires that attempted the engagement trajectory had achieved his altitude, yet were now 4 kilometers ahead of him, having exceeded while ascending. The 2 pursuing from behind were still 4 kilometers back, unable to eliminate distance despite operating at peak sustained power. He had successfully neutralized 4 interceptors without defensive actions, without discharging ordnance, merely by sustaining velocity and altitude. This was the discovery. For 3 years, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aviators had been instructed to evade, to flee, to survive through velocity and fortune. Yet the AR-234 didn't require evasion. The velocity differential was precisely sufficient, the altitude precisely elevated enough. That engagement positioning became impossible within the limited duration of a reconnaissance sortie. The British aviators weren't unskilled. Their machines weren't insufficient. The mechanics merely didn't permit them to accomplish firing location before he finished his operation and withdrew. At 11:22, he established his third and concluding photographic pass. Assurance had superseded apprehension. The Spitfires were still attempting engagement, now accompanied by 2 additional that had launched from an advanced airstrip. 6 fighters total, all attempting to halt 1 reconnaissance machine, all unsuccessful. The third photographic pass was slower and lower, 7,000 meters rather than 8,680 kilometers per hour rather than 740. Summer intentionally provided the Spitfire's superior engagement positioning to evaluate the boundaries. The nearest British fighter accomplished firing location for roughly 8 seconds, releasing a burst from 700 meters. The tracers traveled behind and beneath positioning and closure velocity rendering precise targeting impossible even at diminished velocity differential. He finished the third pass at 11:28. The RB-50/30th camera had consumed all 3 cassettes. 120 exposures total. Comprehensive documentation of the Mulberry Harbor installation from multiple trajectories at elevated resolution. Operation accomplished. Fuel, 1,800 liters, adequate for 45 minutes. Duration to Juvincourt, 25 minutes at diminished power. He turned southeast toward France. The Spitfires, now critically depleted on fuel themselves, following 25 minutes of peak power engagement efforts, withdrew. None had accomplished a firing calculation. None had compelled him to deviate from his operation parameters. They had monitored him on detection equipment, observed him visually, and discharged speculatively. Nothing had succeeded. The homeward flight was routine. At 11:53, he crossed back into German-held airspace. Fuel, 900 liters. At 12:17, precisely 90 minutes following departure, he approached Juvincourt. The touchdown on retractable skids demanded exact velocity management. Excessive velocity and the skids would fail. Insufficient velocity and the machine would stall. He sustained 200 kilometers per hour on concluding approach, contacted smoothly on the grass runway, and slid to halt. The operation was concluded, 0 combat damage. 0 defensive actions required. Comprehensive photographic documentation accomplished. Ground personnel surrounded the machine, retrieving the filmed cassettes and refueling for potential subsequent operations. Summer exited, his flight garment saturated with perspiration despite the cold at altitude. Intelligence analysts took the film for immediate development. Within 4 hours, 120 high-resolution images were developed, examined, and transmitted to OKW headquarters. The intelligence significance was exceptional. Every vessel, every vehicle, every installation at Aromeshes was observable in detail. It was the most thorough aerial intelligence acquired on the Mulberry Harbors since D-Day. The August 2nd operation established a sequence that would continue through late 1944. The AR-234 proved virtually impossible to engage when operated at altitude and peak velocity. Between August and December, Versuchsverband OBDL conducted 87 jet reconnaissance operations above Allied-held territory. The attrition percentage to fighter engagement was 0. 3 machines were destroyed due to power plant malfunction, 2 to ground-based weapons from fortunate strikes, yet not 1 was eliminated by an interceptor. The intelligence acquired was thorough. German leadership finally possessed comprehensive, current reconnaissance of Allied locations, supply concentrations, force deployments, and harbor installations. Yet the intelligence altered nothing. By August 1944, the conflict was already determined. Germany lacked the manufacturing capability to exploit tactical intelligence, lacked the fuel to execute effective counterstrikes, lacked the aerial superiority to attack the objectives identified in reconnaissance images. The harsh paradox was apparent to aviators like Summer. They could observe everything. They could document Allied preparations in perfect detail. They could demonstrate technological superiority above the finest Allied fighters, yet none of it mattered strategically. The AR-234 was a perfect reconnaissance platform, appearing 2 years excessively late. The manufacturing figures conveyed the narrative. From 1943 through 1945, Germany constructed roughly 214 AR-234s of all configurations. During the identical interval, the United States manufactured over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, and Britain constructed more than 20,000 Spitfires of all variants. The manufacturing capability disparity was insurmountable. Germany could construct excellence. The AR-234 demonstrated that. Yet the Allies could construct excellence at magnitude. And in industrial conflict, magnitude was conclusive. Fuel scarcities intensified the challenge. The Jumo 4 power plants demanded J2 jet fuel, a synthetic fuel that consumed limited resources to manufacture. By late 1944, fuel distributions for jet machines were substantially restricted. Preparing new jet aviators demanded fuel that combat missions desperately required. The AR-234 could conduct operations, yet only when fuel was obtainable, which became progressively scarce as Allied bombardment eliminated Germany's synthetic fuel installations. Erich Sommer survived the conflict, conducting reconnaissance operations until March 1945. When fuel scarcities grounded Versuchsverband OBDL, he conducted 23 AR-234 operations total, documenting Allied locations across France, Belgium, and eventually Western Germany as the front disintegrated. Not once was he compelled to evade due to fighter engagement. The velocity advantage persisted until the conclusion. In post-war discussions, Sommer was frank about the AR-234's tactical achievement and strategic insignificance. He stated they demonstrated that jet machines could function with near immunity from reciprocating fighter engagement. Yet demonstrating a principle in 1944 that should have been combat-ready in 1942 was worthless. With 2,000 AR-234s in 1943, they could have monitored every Allied activity, documented every invasion preparation, potentially altered the intelligence equilibrium. With 200 in 1944, they could observe everything and alter nothing. The AR-234's heritage extended beyond its wartime deployment. Post-war, both Britain and the United States examined captured specimens thoroughly. The principle of high-velocity, high-altitude jet reconnaissance directly shaped the creation of machines like the English Electric Canberra and the Martin B-57. The concept Summer validated on August 2, 1944, that velocity and altitude could render an aircraft invulnerable, influenced military aviation for generations. Yet the instruction of the AR-234 wasn't technological, it was industrial. Germany could innovate. German engineers had pioneered jet propulsion, swept wings, rocket power plants. Yet innovation without the manufacturing capability to manufacture at magnitude was strategically worthless. The Allies didn't prevail in the aerial conflict through superior technology. They prevailed through superior manufacturing capability, dependable logistics, and the capacity to replace attrition more rapidly than the adversary could inflict them. On August 2, 1944, Erich Sommer demonstrated a jet machine could document enemy locations with immunity. The intelligence was flawless. The implementation was impeccable. The strategic consequence was zero. That was the authentic narrative of the AR-234 Blitz technological triumph in the context of strategic collapse.